Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm all about diving deep into global economics, trade wars, and how they shake up our everyday lives, especially if you're in business, investing, or just curious about the world stage. Today we're tackling something that's been making headlines non-stop. President Donald Trump's aggressive tariff campaign and how it's reshaping trade deals around the globe. We're going to focus on the wins, the losses, the strategies, and particularly how countries like Japan, the EU, and Canada are navigating this high-stakes game. First off, let's set the scene. It's August 2025, and Trump is back in the White House, pushing his America First agenda harder than ever. Remember his promise during the campaign? 90 trade deals in 90 days. Yeah, that sounded ambitious, right? Well, we've seen some action, deals with Vietnam, the UK, China, and others, but not all of them are ironclad final agreements. A lot are frameworks, kind of like outlines that say, hey, we'll figure out the details later. At the beginning of August, Trump declared victory, claiming his global tariff threats had forced allies into quick pacts before his self-imposed deadlines hit. The pitch was simple. In exchange for capping tariffs around 15% on most goods, these countries would pledge massive investments in the US. On paper, it looks like a slam dunk for American jobs and manufacturing. But in reality, the details are fuzzy, and industries in those partner nations are still sweating bullets. Washington's message boils down to this: invest big in the US or get slapped with even higher tariffs. It's left allies from Europe to Asia in a tough spot, weighing the short-term relief of avoiding worse penalties against the long-term burden of forking over billions in commitments. And here's the kicker. There's always the risk that Trump could flip the script again. We've seen it before. Tariffs go up, deals get tweaked, and everyone's left scrambling. Take Japan's auto sector as a prime example of how these deals have limits. The World Trade Organization dropped a report showing the average US tariff rate now tops 20%, the highest in over a century. For Japanese car makers like Mazda, Toyota, and Honda, that's not just a statistic, it's a real hit to the bottom line. I mean, think about it. Mazda alone is bracing for nearly $1 billion in extra costs this year because of these tariffs. They're ramping up production at their $2 billion plant in Alabama, which they built during Trump's first term. That helps soften the blow a bit, creating jobs in the US and dodging some import duties. But here's the reality check. Half of Mazda's cars sold in the US are still made in Japan. And they've got a huge factory in Mexico that's hanging in the balance until the US finalizes terms with Mexico. So, instead of the stability Trump promised, it's more like ongoing uncertainty. Executives at Mazda are saying things like, we have to brace for the impact and work hard to overcome these incremental costs. It's not panic, but it's definitely not smooth sailing. Now let's shift over to Europe, where the metal sector is feeling a similar pinch. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has been touting this framework trade agreement with the US as a lifeline for Europe's metals industry. She says it'll provide support, but honestly, the details are still in short supply. Brussels managed to ink a deal promising tariff cuts and some kind of quota system for exports. Sounds good, right? But steel and aluminum from the EU are still facing a brutal 50% duty. That quota system, which is supposed to let some goods in duty-free, isn't even fully defined yet. The European Steel Association is raising alarms, pointing out that US tariffs have already hammered an industry worth more than $90 billion a year, and with demand falling globally, they're weakened even further. Business leaders are basically saying, we're in the dark here, relying on promises that might not hold up. These stories from Japan and Europe illustrate a bigger point. Rushing to sign these deals hasn't magically erased the pressure. It's like putting a band-aid on a deep cut. It covers it up temporarily, but the wound's still there. Contrast that with Canada, which took a completely different route. Ottawa flat-out refused to sign under duress, accepting a 35% tariff on goods outside the USMCA. That's the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, for those who might not be familiar. At first glance, 35% sounds brutal, doesn't it? But here's where the nuance comes in. The USMCA exempts the vast majority of Canadian trade. According to Scotiabank's chief economist, Jean-François Perrault, between 85% and 95% of exports are still tariff-free under the deal. When you average it out, Canada's effective tariff rate is only about 5% to 6%. Yeah, that's painful for certain sectors, but it's way lower than the 15% baseline that Europe, Japan or South Korea are dealing with. So while Canada has felt the sting of Trump's tariffs, the country's turning inward rather than tying its future to Washington's whims. They're focusing on domestic priorities, like major infrastructure projects, affordability for everyday folks, and community security. This was super evident in a recent meeting between Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford in Ottawa. They weren't just complaining about tariffs, they were emphasizing building national competitiveness and resilience. Some Canadians are questioning if the government's being too passive, but the data tells a different story. By holding firm, Canada avoided the worst outcomes, kept its broader economy intact, and maintained leverage for future negotiations. Unlike the allies who promised hundreds of billions in investments, Canada hasn't mortgaged its long-term position for a quick fix. Remember what the Prime Minister said during the election campaign? No deal is better than a bad deal. And they're sticking to that. No rushing into something that'll bite them later. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Nations that sprinted to sign before August 1st are now saddled with hefty investment costs and that lingering fog of uncertainty. Japan's car makers and Europe's steel producers are proof that the pain doesn't vanish post-agreement. Canada, by standing its ground, took targeted hits in specific industries, but preserved the big picture and kept its negotiating chips on the table. This isn't about surrendering, it's a strategy of endurance. With strengths in energy exports, critical minerals, and a tightly integrated supply chain, Canada is a partner the US can't easily swap out. Trump might keep escalating, but Carney's approach of strategic patience seems like the smartest counter to Washington's unpredictable demands. All right, let's zoom in on one of the biggest announcements, Trump's deal with the European Union. He called it his biggest trade deal yet, agreeing to a new trade framework. We've reached a deal. It's a good deal for everybody, he said. At the heart of it is a 15% blanket tariff on most European goods entering the US. Pharmaceuticals get a pass, but steel and aluminum are still hammered with that 50% tariff under national security rules. In exchange, the EU committed to $750 billion in energy purchases from the US and $600 billion in new investments. Plus, they agreed to beef up defense procurement, though no hard numbers were shared there. But here's the thing. This isn't a binding treaty. It's just a framework, announced mere days before a 30% tariff was about to kick in. That timing? Totally not accidental. It's the classic Trump playbook. Apply pressure, then seal the deal. We've heard him talk about it, pressure then deal. The investments and purchases are massive. $750 billion in energy, $600 billion in investments. And in return, the European market, 450 million people strong, gets some predictability. But is it really open? This pattern isn't unique to the EU. We've seen it with Japan, the UK, Vietnam, threaten steep tariffs, stir up speculation for days or weeks, then unveil a framework with that 15% baseline and big foreign commitments. This flips the whole trade conversation on its head. Traditionally, trade deals are about tearing down barriers to make things freer and cheaper. But Trump's model, it's about creating predictability and charging a premium for it. That 15% now feels moderate because the alternative he dangles is always worse, like 25% or 30%. It's not liberalization, it's transactional stability. And the pattern is crystal clear. Allies, competitors, everyone pays up. Now, all eyes are on Canada. A 35% tariff loomed on August 1st if no deal was reached, but Ottawa made it plain. The deadline's political, not etched in stone, and they won't be bullied into a bad agreement. The EU and Japan are longtime US allies too, and they both caved to Trump's terms. Canada knows that, but they're not sitting on their hands. Canada brings serious leverage. Over $1 trillion in investments into the US, deeply intertwined energy and auto supply chains, and decades of cross-border ties with key states. Think Alberta's oil feeding US refineries or Ontario's parts plants keeping Detroit humming. These aren't fluffy advantages, they're concrete influence points. Carney's government is observing the sequence, not fighting it head-on. Their strategy? Don't be first. Be smart. The feds have already tempered public expectations. Early talk of a great deal has evolved into a more grounded message. This is about managing trade-offs. Lessons from other deals are stark. No one's gotten full exemptions, baseline tariffs are the new normal, and diving into vague frameworks like Japan and the EU did might dodge immediate pain, but brew bigger issues down the line. Instead, Ottawa's prepping, collaborating with provinces, pinpointing vulnerable sectors, and scouting for targeted offsets. Trade talks are ongoing, just not on Trump's timetable. Trump's system thrives on leverage and price tags, not trust. But that doesn't force Canada to fold. It pushes them to craft a deal safeguarding autos, energy, digital trade, whatever matters most. The true risk isn't stalling, it's caving too soon for scraps. In this shifted landscape, hesitating countries might take hits, but Russia's could lock into regrettable terms. Carney gets that. Better a right deal late than a wrong one early. Speaking of Japan specifically, Trump hyped his deal there as possibly the largest in history. Canada's ties are way more integrated across the border than Japan's, but it's still insightful. Trump called it the biggest US trade deal ever. Japan agreed to 15% on auto exports, down from a threatened 25%. In return, $550 billion in US investments for energy, rare earths and manufacturing. Classic Trump win at first blush, but for Canada, it's a cautionary tale. This deal isn't closing a chapter, it's kicking off a strategy, and now that strategy's hitting pushback. Japanese close US allies still got slapped with 15%. Trump said no exemptions, baseline 10 to 15% even for buddies, no reverting to 2 to 3%. The terms raised Ottawa's eyebrows. Japan couldn't ditch key sectoral tariffs like on steel. Those Section 232 ones stick around. The 15% auto tariff is 5 times pre-Trump levels. If Japan with its clout couldn't score full exemptions, Canada's no-tariff dreams look dim. But instead of mimicking, Carney's pivoting from defense to offense. If the US demands baselines, Canada pushes to axe sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, autos. If Trump balks, Canada's ready to go solo. I don't trust President Trump as far as I can throw him. He changes his mind constantly, folks are saying. It's not just federal. Ontario's Doug Ford notes Canada buys $349 billion from the US yearly versus Japan's $79 billion. We're not minor, we're the top customer. Provinces are rallying, Alberta to Nova Scotia, boosting domestic steel, clean energy, critical minerals, investing in SMRs, small modular reactors, new pipelines bypassing US reliance. Message: if Washington won't ease up, Canada won't beg, we'll self-sustain. He's our friend, but right now Trump's acting like the enemy, some say. Trump's tariffs pressure partners, but this could boomerang. Canada's built leverage, US steel alcohol imports down, tourism plunged 60% since March, 2025 tariffs per Stats Canada. Not protest, real impact. As Trump touts Japan as a model, Ottawa studies to counter logic. If he wants concessions for investments, we demand fairness for access. Otherwise, selective pushback via tariffs, diversification, regs hitting US firms in Canada. Japan deal was to set tone, instead it sparked Canada's rewrite. Carney builds leverage, provinces reinforce with pipelines, manufacturing, cutting US dependence. August 1st is a marker, but Canada's playing its game, eyes open. The F-150, top American vehicle, uses Quebec aluminum. Tariffs, self-harm bubbles up in US auto sector. August 1st escalated, tariffs on non-USMCA Canadian goods, steel aluminum at 50%, highest disruptive aggressive. Steel's core to North American autos, so Trump shakes his own base. Tremendous impact. Customers, distributors for years gone overnight from uncertainty, say Canadian firms. Exports dropped 25 to 35% per Auto Parts Manufacturers Association. Lost contracts, idle factories, layoffs. In Toronto, Conquest Steel's US business vanished from fear alone. But Canada's pivoting, domestic focus, new lines, capacity investments. Carney aims for resilience, not revenge. US autos depend on Canadian steel aluminum, F-Series from Quebec. Costs rise, assembly hurts. Can't switch suppliers fast, vehicle prices up thousands, some $9,000. Trump targets Canada, hits Michigan. Moves performative, August deadline, bilateral deals thin on substance. Canada refused rush like Japan, Korea, EU. Agreements strain, per John Charest. Carney, bad deal under pressure, not worth it. If White House helps Detroit, helps Ontario, but blanket aims sink all, including US firms. Tariffs punish neighbour, but US economy suffers more. Disrupted chains, rising costs, no exit. Canada's adapting, investing inward, planning beyond US. America's industrial base absorbs the blow. This tests leadership. Canada takes hit, but US feels pain. Let's start by digging deeper into the auto industry, because it's one of the biggest battlegrounds in this tariff saga. We touched on Japan's struggles in part 1, but let's expand on that. Japanese automakers like Toyota, Honda, and Mazda are getting hit hard by the US's 20% average tariff rate, the highest in over a century, according to the World Trade Organization. For context, before Trump's return to office in January 2025, Japan was dealing with tariffs closer to 2 to 3% on autos. Now they're locked into 15% on vehicles exported to the US, which is a steep climb. Mazda, for example, is staring down $1 billion in extra costs this year alone. They're trying to offset that by leaning into their Alabama plant, a $2 billion investment from Trump's first term. It's creating American jobs, sure, but it's not a full fix. Half their cars sold in the US still come from Japan, and their Mexico plant is in limbo until the US-Mexico terms are sorted out. This isn't just about numbers, it's about the real-world chaos. Imagine you're a Mazda executive. You've got factories in multiple countries, supply chains crisscrossing borders, and suddenly you're hit with tariffs that jack up your costs overnight. You can't just move all production to the US. That takes years, not months. Plus, retooling plants or building new ones costs billions, and you're already committed to that Alabama facility. So what do? You raise prices, cut margins, or both. That's why we're seeing estimates that US car prices could jump by thousands. Some projections say up to $9,000 for tariff-heavy models. And who feels that? American consumers, dealerships, and even US automakers reliant on global parts. Let's cross the Pacific and look at South Korea, another US ally caught in this tariff web. South Korea signed a framework deal similar to Japan's, agreeing to a 15% tariff on electronics and autos in exchange for $400 billion in US investments, mostly in semiconductors and green energy. Sounds impressive, but the fine print is messy. Hyundai and Samsung are ramping up US-based production. Hyundai's got a $7.6 billion electric vehicle plant in Georgia, but their supply chains still rely heavily on Asia. Tariffs on imported components mean higher costs, and unlike Canada's USMCA protections, South Korea's deal doesn't shield much of their trade. The Korea Economic Institute estimates that 60% of South Korea's exports to the US face tariffs above 10%, compared to Canada's 5 to 6% effective rate. That's a huge gap, and it's forcing Seoul to pour money into the US to avoid even worse penalties. Now let's pivot to Europe's steel and aluminum sector, because it's another stark example of how these deals promise relief but deliver headaches. The EU's framework with the US was billed as a win by Ursula von der Leyen, with that $750 billion energy purchase and $600 billion investment pledge. But steel and aluminum? Still slammed with a 50% duty. The quota system that's supposed to allow some duty-free exports sounds great in theory, but it's not finalized. The European Steel Association says this uncertainty is crippling an industry already worth $90 billion annually, battered by global demand drops. Picture a steel plant in Germany or Belgium. Orders are down, costs are up, and you're waiting on a quota system that exists only on paper. Business leaders are frustrated, saying they're left with promises, not plans. It's like signing a contract without reading the terms. You hope it works out, but you're not sure what you've agreed to. This brings us to a key question. Why are these deals so shaky? It's because Trump's approach isn't about long-term trade liberalization. It's about leveraging fear of higher tariffs, 25%, 30% or more, to extract commitments. The 15% baseline feels reasonable only because the alternative is so much worse. It's a transactional game, not a cooperative one. Countries are paying for predictability, not free trade. And the pressure doesn't stop once the ink's dry. Japan and the EU thought signing early would ease the pain, but they're still facing sectoral tariffs, undefined quotas, and the risk that Trump could change his mind. He's done it before, tweaking deals or slapping on new tariffs when the mood strikes. Now let's talk about Canada's strategy, because it's a masterclass in playing the long game. Unlike Japan or the EU, Canada didn't rush to sign before Trump's August 1st deadline. They accepted a 35% tariff on non-USMCA goods, which sounds harsh but affects only a small slice of their trade. Thanks to the USMCA, 85 to 95% of Canada's exports to the US remain tariff-free, per Scotiabank's Jean-François Perrault. That keeps their effective tariff rate at 5 to 6%, way below the 15% Japan and the EU are dealing with. But Canada's not just sitting back. They're actively building resilience. Prime Minister Mark Carney and provincial leaders like Ontario's Doug Ford are doubling down on domestic priorities: infrastructure, affordability, and economic security. Take Ontario, for example. It's home to Canada's auto parts industry, a critical piece of the North American supply chain. When tariffs hit, companies like Conquest Steel in Toronto saw US orders dry up, not because tariffs were enforced, but because uncertainty froze business. Instead of panicking, they're pivoting to domestic buyers and investing in new product lines. Across the country, provinces are pushing similar moves. Alberta's investing in clean energy and critical minerals. Nova Scotia's boosting manufacturing. There's even talk of small modular nuclear reactors, SMRs, and pipelines that bypass US dependency. This isn't just about weathering the storm, it's about making Canada less reliant on the US market long term. Carney's mantra, "No deal is better than a bad deal," is resonating. Canada's not saying no to talks, they're just refusing to be rushed. They've got leverage. $1 trillion in US investments, integrated energy and auto supply chains, and deep ties with states like Michigan and Texas. Alberta's oil powers US refineries. Ontario's parts keep Detroit's assembly lines running. These aren't abstract advantages, they're economic lifelines. And Canada's using them strategically. They're pushing to eliminate sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and lumber, and if Trump won't budge, they're prepared to counter with their own measures. Imports of US steel and alcohol are already down, and tourism to the US has plummeted 60% since March 2025, per Statistics Canada. That's not just a protest, it's economic muscle. Let's zoom out and look at the US side, because the tariffs are starting to bite at home. The Ford F-150, America's top-selling vehicle, relies on aluminum from Quebec. When Canada's steel and aluminum face 50% tariffs, it drives up costs for US automakers. Ford and GM are already sounding alarms, saying, "You're burning our profits." Industry estimates warn of vehicle price hikes, anywhere from a few thousand to $9,000 for models heavy on imported materials. That's not just a Canadian problem. It's hitting Michigan, Ohio, and every dealership in between. Trump's aiming at Canada, but the blow's landing on his own industrial base. You can't disrupt a supply chain that integrated without collateral damage. This gets us to the heart of why Canada's approach stands out. They're not just reacting, they're rewriting the rules. While Japan and the EU signed deals to avoid worse tariffs, Canada's betting on endurance. They're studying those agreements, not to copy, but to counter. If Trump wants investments, Canada wants fairness, like scrapping those 50% steel tariffs. If that doesn't happen, they're ready with selective pushback, targeted tariffs, market diversification, or regulations that make life harder for US firms in Canada. It's a calculated move, not a desperate one. Let's wrap this part up with a quick look at the broader picture. Trump's trade system thrives on leverage and price tags, not trust. He's flipped the script. Trade deals aren't about mutual wins anymore. They're about who can pay more for stability. But Canada's showing that you don't have to play by his rules. By holding firm, investing inward, and leveraging their economic ties, they're carving out a path that protects their interests without locking into shaky terms. August 1st was a deadline, but it wasn't the endgame. Canada's playing chess while others are playing checkers, and that's why their strategy is worth watching. In Part 1, we explored the big picture promises, the rushed deals with allies like Japan and the European Union, and Canada's bold decision to hold out for something better. Part 2 dove into industry-specific impacts, from autos in Asia to metals in Europe, and how Canada's resilience strategy is setting them apart. If you missed those, hit pause and catch up. They're packed with the context you need. Now in Part 3, we're wrapping it all up. Analysing the long-term consequences, what this means for global trade norms, potential escalations, and why strategic patience might be the ultimate winner in this unpredictable game. We'll keep it conversational, loaded with examples and real-talk insights to help you make sense of it all. Let's jump right in. First, let's recap the core dynamics at play here, because understanding the foundation will make the forward-looking stuff hit harder. Trump's back in the White House as of January 2025, and he's not wasting time reviving his America First playbook. The goal? 90 trade deals in 90 days. Ambitious, right? We've seen frameworks pop up with Vietnam, the United Kingdom, China and more, but they're often vague outlines rather than rock-solid treaties. The strategy hinges on threats, looming tariffs of 25%, 30%, or even 35% to force quick concessions. In return, partners get a capped 15% baseline on most goods, plus they pledge massive investments in the United States, like Japan's $550 billion for energy and manufacturing, or the European Union's whopping $600 billion plus $750 billion in energy buys. It sounds like leverage paying off, but as we've seen, the devil's in the details, or lack thereof. Take the uncertainty factor. For Japanese automakers, that 15% auto tariff is 5 times higher than pre-Trump levels, and sectoral hits like steel's Section 232 tariffs remain untouched. Mazda's dealing with $1 billion in added costs, pushing them to expand United States production but leaving half their output exposed. Similarly, South Korea's electronics and autos are under a 15% blanket, with Hyundai investing billions in Georgia plants, yet their Asian supply chains keep costs elevated. Over in Europe, the steel industry's quota system is still undefined, leaving a $90 billion sector in limbo amid falling demand. These aren't isolated hiccups, they're symptoms of deals signed under duress, where short-term relief masks long-term strains. Now, let's talk about the economic ripple effects beyond the headlines. Tariffs aren't just taxes on imports, they reshape entire ecosystems. In the United States, higher input costs from Canadian steel and aluminum are jacking up prices for everything from cars to construction. The Ford F-150, America's best-selling truck, sources aluminum from Quebec. With 50% tariffs on those metals, assembly costs soar, and automakers like Ford and General Motors are warning it's eroding profits. Projections suggest United States vehicle prices could rise $3,000 to $9,000 per unit, depending on sourcing. That's not abstract economics. It's higher sticker prices at dealerships, squeezed margins for suppliers, and potential job shifts as companies adapt. Detroit's feeling the pinch, with supply chains so integrated that hurting Canada inevitably boomerangs back. On the global stage, this is flipping trade norms upside down. Traditional deals like those under the World Trade Organization aimed for barrier reduction and mutual gains. Trump's model? It's pay-to-play stability. The 15% baseline isn't a ceiling. It's the floor you buy access to by committing billions in investments or purchases. Allies pay for predictability, competitors pay more, and no one gets full exemptions. The World Trade Organization's report on United States tariffs exceeding 20%, the highest in a century, signals a retreat from multilateralism toward bilateral arm-twisting. For smaller economies like Vietnam, which signed a framework for tech and agriculture investments, it means diverting resources to the United States at the expense of domestic growth. The United Kingdom, post-Brexit, pledged $400 billion in defence and energy, but their exporters still face that 15% on goods, adding friction to an already challenged economy. Let's zoom in on China, because it's a wild card in this mix. Trump's deals there aren't as publicized, but frameworks suggest a 20 to 25% tariff range on tech and manufacturing, with China committing to rare earth supplies and United States farm buys. It's an extension of the Phase 1 deal from his first term, but escalated. Chinese firms are responding by accelerating de-risking, shifting production to Vietnam or Mexico to dodge duties. But here's the irony. Mexico's exposed until its own terms are finalized, creating a domino effect. Industries worldwide are rethinking supply chains, investing in redundancy to avoid single-country reliance. That's good for resilience, but bad for efficiency. Costs rise, innovation slows, and consumers everywhere pay more. Shifting back to Canada, their approach is emerging as a potential blueprint for others. By refusing to sign a rushed framework, they accepted targeted pain, a 35% tariff on non-USMCA goods, but protected the bulk of their trade. With 85 to 95% exempt under USMCA, their effective rate is a manageable 5 to 6%. Prime Minister Mark Carney's emphasizing endurance over expediency, channeling resources inward. Meetings with premiers like Doug Ford highlight priorities, major projects for infrastructure, affordability measures to ease household burdens, and security enhancements in communities. It's not passivity, it's proactive. Provinces are stepping up. Alberta's ramping critical minerals and energy independence. Ontario's bolstering auto manufacturing with domestic focus. This inward turn is yielding tangible shifts. Canadian auto parts exports dropped 25 to 35% due to uncertainty, per the Canadian Auto Parts Manufacturers Association, but firms like Conquest Steel are pivoting to local markets and innovating product lines. Investments in SMRs and bypass pipelines reduce US dependency, while diversification, boosting trade with Europe and Asia, spreads risk. Canada's leverage is multifaceted. $1 trillion in US investments, integrated chains where Alberta oil fuels Texas refineries and Ontario parts sustain Michigan factories. They're not bluffing. US imports from Canada in key sectors are irreplaceable short-term. And the pushback? US steel and alcohol imports are down. Tourism fell 60% since March 2025. Real economic signals that Canada won't be pushed around. Carney's no deal better than a bad deal philosophy contrasts sharply with rushed signers. Japan couldn't eliminate steel tariffs despite $550 billion pledges. The EU's quotas remain vague despite $1.35 trillion commitments. Canada's holding cards for future talks, aiming to scrap sectoral tariffs on lumber, autos and metals. If Trump escalates, they're prepared. Selective tariffs, regulatory tweaks on US firms in Canada, or market shifts. It's a game of chess, building leverage quietly while others react impulsively. Looking ahead, what could escalation look like? Trump's August 1st deadlines were political theatre, but if partners don't deliver on investments, he could hike tariffs or add new ones. For Canada, 35% non-USMCA hit targets steel hardest, but if broadened, it could strain energy or digital trade. Yet, Canada's prepping offsets, identifying vulnerable sectors, collaborating with provinces and managing expectations. The real danger for Trump? Backfire. US automakers are lobbying against policies that burn profits, and rising consumer prices could fuel domestic backlash. If vehicle costs jump $9,000, it's voters in swing states feeling it. Globally, this could spark a tariff arms race. If the EU retaliates on US exports, say Boeing planes or tech, tensions rise. Japan might deepen ties with China for alternatives, fracturing alliances. The WTO could see more disputes, but with US tariffs at historic highs, multilateral fixes seem distant. Positives? Forced investments boost US jobs in energy and manufacturing, potentially strengthening supply chains. But at what cost? Higher inflation slowed growth and eroded trust. For Canada, the outlook's cautiously optimistic. By enduring short-term hits, they preserve negotiating power. Carney's team isn't chasing deadlines, they're shaping outcomes. Provinces reinforce this. Pipelines, manufacturing hubs, reduced US reliance. It's not isolationism, it's smart sovereignty. As Trump touts biggest deals ever, Canada's rewriting engagement rules, proving patience counters unpredictability. In wrapping this series, Trump's tariff push reshapes trade, from liberalization to transactionalism, where everyone pays for access. Rushed deals bring relief, but regrets. Canada's holdout shows endurance wins. Whether you're in business, policy, or just watching, this saga's far from over. Stay tuned for updates. Thanks for joining. Drop thoughts in comments, subscribe, and hit that bell. See you next time.